Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today about the Sunbury Music Festivals, which ran in Victoria on the Australia Day weekend each year from 1972 through to 1975. Now, I understand to some of you this might represent a pre-medieval past. To those older, perhaps there may be some familiarity and even fond reminiscence. Nevertheless, there is a need for some archaeology of the past if we are to understand where our entertainment industry has come from and where it might be headed. This presentation is therefore, in archaeological terms, a desktop study, giving us an opportunity to understand some of the context in which these festivals were run and something of the now primitive technology. Music festivals have been around since the early 1960s, mostly related to folk, blues and jazz. It was not long before they evolved to include contemporary music. The Fantasy Fair and Magic Mountain Music Festival was held at Mount Tamalpais, California on 10th to 11th of June 1967, and it attracted 36,000 attendees. It was the first of its genre of large-scale multi-act festivals featuring mainly contemporary music. The future of the large-scale outdoor music festival was cemented 1 week later in Monterey, also in California, on 16th and 18th of June 1967, with attendances of more than 50,000 on each of 3 days. Monterey was followed 2 years later by the hugely successful and famous 3 days of peace, love and music that was Woodstock, held in August 1969. The Woodstock Festival attracted a crowd estimated at 500,000 strong. All these festivals attracted younger people drawn from the post-war generation, and all began a descent into informality in their audiences. No formal seating, no formal accommodation, just a grassy slope and clusters of tents. Both Monterey and Woodstock were filmed, and the exhibition of these films, the album sales and worldwide press coverage awakened the world to the possibilities of large outdoor music festivals. Although Sunbury could not compete with Woodstock in terms of sheer numbers, both events had similarly marked effects on the culture of their times, both in the terms of music and the attitudes of a generation. The Woodstock concept was almost immediately imported into Australia. Australia's pioneering festival was Arimba's Pilgrimage for Pop, held near Gosford in New South Wales, only months after Woodstock. It also pioneered an important date for Australian musical festivals that continues to the present day, the Australia Day weekend. Arimba attracted an audience quickly swelling to 10,000 in soaring temperatures. It was a true hippie fest inspired by peace, love and music. The festival was compared by beat poet Adrian Rawlins and featured groups which quickly became the backbone of the Australian festival circuit. Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs, Jeff St. John, Max Merritt and the Meteors, Chain, Tully, Wendy Saddington, Spectrum, Company Kane and Leo DeCastro and Friends. Now, the Miracle Festival at Kunara Farm on the Don Road, 5 miles north of Launching Place, near Warburton in Victoria, expected an attendance of 20,000 and was scheduled to begin on Easter Saturday, 28th of March 1970. It was produced by a consortium which included promoters Peter Andrews and Michael Browning. However, just before the festival officially opened, so did the heavens, turning what had been a potentially excellent site into a quagmire. The next lot of festivals, all held outside Victoria on or 1 week after the Australia Day weekend of 1971, had mixed success. The Odyssey Festival at Wallacia, 70 kilometres west of Sydney, on the Australia Day weekend of 22nd to 24th of January 1971, was organised by some of the same promoters as Arimba and attracted an attendance of between 7,000 and 10,000. And in true hippie style, the lighting crew from Sydney's Rainbow Lights were paid in herbal consumables. Even more successful in Wallachia was the Maiponga Festival in South Australia, 1 week later, on 30 to 31st of January and 1st of February 1971, and featured the first overseas groups to play at an Australian festival. British group Black Sabbath, American duo Black Fire, and Hungarian band Sirius. Maiponga attracted an audience exceeding that of Wallachia, with 16,000 forking out an entrance fee of $6, while many, many more just jumped the fence. Although a roomy stage was provided, Ross Wilson recorded the facilities were few. The vibe, however, was excellent, although it was apparent that the hippie concept of peace, love and hallucinogens was gradually being replaced by alcohol as the force driving the experience of the attendees. The promoters just about broke even, and the festival is fondly remembered as a huge success by those who attended. Now, I'd been employed in the lighting department at GTV9 from January 1969. I was also running a small rock lighting business on my rare evenings off, at first using the meagre installed equipment in venues and then purchasing my own equipment to augment it. This included some electronic equipment custom built for me by Ian Whitelaw, another member of the GTV9 lighting department. Now, I must have been reasonably successful as I managed to purchase a mini Moke for cash directly from the proceeds of my lighting gigs, trading as the ESP Light Show. Some of the luminaires were purchased directly from Strand Electric, but most of it had to be homemade. I also purchased a trailer and fitted it out to carry my lighting rig. Not quite equal to today's show freight Pantech. Overhead projectors were modified with flutter wheels. Washing machine timer motors provided drives. Colour wheels could be made cheaply using old 16mm film cans. Clouds were scrubbed off standard Strand effect discs and repainted with lamp lacquer and projected through break-up glasses. Motorised multifaceted prisms were fitted to standard projection lenses. Now, the open stage of an overhead projector could be used for moire effects and wet shows using large clock faces filled with dyed immiscible liquids, or a simple slide made with a sheet of perspex painted with lamp lacquer and drizzled in araldite like this one. A similar effect could be made for 35mm projectors by simply partially melting an old slide with a match. Heat-proof slide glasses could be glued in layers to brass tubing and filled with glycerin and food dyes. Aquarium pumps were provided a source of air to blow bubbles through the mixture. Yellow food dye in one section and blue in the other provided green where they crossed over. Now, I attended the Wallachia Festival in 1971. The context of these festivals was important. Australia was going through a period of nationalism and cultural revival. Australian stories and voices were appearing on the films of Peter Weir and the plays of David Williamson. Patrick White had just won a Nobel Prize for Literature, and Hector Crawford was pioneering Australian television drama. New bands and new record labels were selling Australian music on the basis of live performance and not radio airplay. Live music venues proliferated in every Australian capital, but especially in Melbourne. New recording studios and new young engineers were giving bands a voice, and a new, more Australian sound was emerging. The cultural cringe was receding, perhaps forever. Politically, things were changing too. The war in Vietnam and conscription had divided Australia. In Victoria, the days of the repressive regime of Henry Bolte were about to change to an arts-conscious and a more truly liberal Dick Hamer, Federally, the days of the tired Liberal government were numbered, with Gough Whitlam swept to power in late 1972. The new government would not only withdraw from Vietnam, but develop strong policies favouring the arts. It was within this context that I arrived at Wallachia a week early and watched as the festival was set up, shooting 20 minutes of Super 8 film covering the entire festival. As with previous Australian festivals, the lighting rig concentrated on effects at the expense of stage illumination. Overall stage light levels were low. With youthful hubris, I resolved to do better if ever I got the chance, and that chance was not long in the waiting. On my way, after returning to GDV, I was raving to the head of the lighting department, John Fowler. Wallachia had been an exciting experience for me. John was sceptical and wondered why anyone would run such an event. My reply was 15,000 kids times $5. In that moment, the Sunbury festivals were conceived, but would be a year in gestation. Now, John Fowler put together a team consisting of himself, his wife Rosemary, his solicitor Graham Rhys-Jones, and film director John Dixon. GDV9 producer Jim McKay would handle publicity, and even the festival poster was designed at GDV9. Ray Evans and Michael Gudinski would book the bands. A young Adrian Anderson was hired to put together a team of crack roadies to handle stage management. All that was needed was the site for the festival. Late in 1971, a site was finally found at Diggers Rest, northwest of Melbourne. Glencoe Farm was owned by George and Beryl Duncan. In the interest of doing something for young people, no charge would be made for the use of the property. The Duncans would, however, benefit from some water reticulation and rock clearance from part of the property. Graham Rhys-Jones obtained the necessary legal permissions against stiff opposition from the Balti government. No doubt legislation could have been enacted to prevent the festival, but the Victorian Parliament was in recess. Instead, Balti enlisted the assistance of the CFA to try and stop the festival. Rhys-Jones prevailed and the way was clear to stage the festival. And meetings were held on site to get arrangements underway. A stage site was chosen in a natural amphitheatre with camping areas on the flats along Jackson's Creek. The creek was surreptitiously dammed to provide some extra water for swimming. Rocks were cleared from the audience area and the grass mowed and watered to keep it clean. As Diggers Rest was not considered a marketable name, the festival took the name of the nearest town to become the Sunbury Summer Happening, with the byline bigger than big. A photo shoot with Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs was used to promote the festival in the music press. The intended aim was Australian music to an Australian audience on Australia Day. Infrastructure for a small city was installed, including roads, water supply, toilets, showers and general lighting. St John's Ambulance installed a large field hospital and the Victoria Police a command centre complete with radio communications for the site. An enlightened attitude by Police Commander Mick Miller ensured that the attendancy would be treated, in his words, as amiable eccentrics. Now, the festival opened on the Friday night of the Australia Day weekend in 1972. The festival grounds were already flooded with punters. No music was planned for the Friday night, but the bands, many already on site, could not wait, and the music started as soon as it got dark and continued until the early hours of Saturday morning. By this time, it was clear the festival was already a roaring success. The official estimate of the crowd was 35,000. although that does not include the thousands who evaded security by sneaking in through neighbouring properties. The only people who really know how many were at the 1972 festival are the Australian Taxation Department. They flew a light plane over the property, taking photographs, attempting to count the people to know if the promoters may have been underreporting ticket sales. The PA system was supplied by Jans, very big for its day, 2 RCA W bins, 4 Jans U bins, 2 JBL 90-degree horns, 2 JBL long throw horns, and 2 JBL high-frequency drivers, and 10 Jans 150-watt power amplifiers, and 1 20-channel Jans mixing console. Now, the majority of the mixing was done by Howard Page from a truck sited at side of stage. Passive splits were provided to Channel 7, which was broadcasting the event, to the TCS truck recording the festival, and a rough mix was sent to a Nagra recorder as a guide track for the crew from Cambridge Film shooting on 16mm for eventual theatrical release. Although 1500 watts was state-of-the-art at the time and an important element of the success of the Sunbury Festival, similar systems would be used in suburban pubs a decade later. However, at that time, it would have been the biggest system many bands would have used. It also included early monitor wedges, something many local musicians, including Phil Manning, had never seen before. Now, performance lighting was supplied by my ESP light show. This is one of my original drawings now held in the archives of the Victorian Performing Arts Centre. No CAD drawings then, everything was done by hand with protractors to work out lens angles and sight lines. If lucky, you had a plastic template for drawing the luminoids and a book of cinemoids to choose gel colours. In an era before park hands, the majority of the luminaires were from the standard strand range. The front of house for 1972 included 2-strand pattern 293 follow spots, 2-strand pattern 243 2 kilowatt Fresnels, and 8-strand pattern 23 1 kilowatt Fresnels. For those luminaires rigged on the follow spot towers, 4 cables were trenched out to each tower and buried in conduit. The cables terminated at the stage in a central position at the lighting console. On stage were 6-strand pattern 223 1 kilowatt Fresnels, 6-strand pattern 23 500 watt profile spots, 4-strand pattern 45 500 watt Fresnels, and 1-strand pattern 60 flood work light. The effects rig used on the rear of stage screen included 2-strand pattern 152 1 kilowatt effects projectors and custom discs, 2-strand 12-inch mirror balls, 1-strand 18-inch mirror ball, 1-strand Solar One effects projector, 2 Bell & Howell 250 watt overhead projectors, and 3 Kodak SAV 2050 slide projectors. Now, the system was controlled by a custom lighting console built for me by fellow GTV lighting crew member Ian Whitelaw. Now, I apologise for the poor quality of this image, but it's the only close-up I have of the console. The solid-state dimmers were all on board and terminated in 24 outlets at the rear of the console. Power inlet was by a single 3-phase cable. There were 12 2-kilowatt dimmer channels. Since suitable linear faders could not be obtained, the faders were mechanically geared via rack and pinion to rotary pots. Although mechanically complex, the system worked well in practice. Above each fader was a corresponding row of 3-position paddle switches. Up was latched full on, central was preset dimmer level, and down was momentary spring loaded. Down could be used to flash a dimmer channel to full, and the paddles played like a keyboard. Now, to my knowledge, these were the first flash buttons on any Australian-built lighting console. The first 6 dimmer channels could also be audio modulated, with 6 balanced jack inputs on the left panel and a corresponding audio level control. In normal practice, an individual performer's amp could be mic'd and used to modulate his or her illumination. In practice at Sunbury, I simply mic'd the top, mid and bottom sections of both sides of the PA. To the right of the dimmer channels are 6 2-kilowatt hard switches for controlling non-dimmable light sources, like slide or overhead projectors, strobes, or for firing flash pots via transformers. At top right on the console were 6 channels of flip-flop control divided into 3 sections. At the top, LED indicators showed the flash rate. Paddle switches beneath these indicators enabled either or both channels to be selected, and rotary pots below these controlled the speed of the flip-flop. Below these again, master switches enabled each section to be switched in or out. The advantage of the flip-flop system was that it controlled 4 kilowatts of luminaires while consuming only 2 kilowatts of power. In an era where 3-phase power could not be found in every venue, and sometimes agricultural methods had to be used to obtain power, this could be an important consideration. The central section of the upper panel contained a main breaker and a meter switchable to each phase for monitoring purposes. A master blackout switch was provided, as well as a key to lock the console when it had to be left during the day. Lastly, there was a dimmable work light built into the top of the console. A later edition included an onboard talkback system. The Sunbury power was supplied by a trailer-mounted diesel generator. No blimp generator was available, and the generator was simply placed as far from the stage as possible. Nevertheless, at each blackout, the generator would race before the governor regained control, and then the generator would labour when the stage lighting was switched to full again. I'm sure I took years off the life of that generator.
And don't you know it's the most? Don't you know it's the most? Well, I ain't gonna stop trying till I created a disturbance in your mind. Everybody sing after me. Here we go. Here we go. Whoa!
Now that may seem very primitive to you today with all your unlimited power, low heat and high output LED luminaires, moving lights, hazers and giant LED screens, all computer controlled. In 1972, Sunbury was pretty much state of the art. I'm still proud of what we were able to achieve. What I think is important is today, these festivals are still fondly remembered by most of those who were there. Of course, they're all now grandparents. Sunbury was the first Australian music festival to be run by entertainment professionals, as opposed to a bunch of hippies with a spare paddock and a good idea. It ushered in improvements in band bookings, included the first professional performance contract arrangements for Australian rock musicians. And for the first time, Australian rock artists could perform to a very large audience on a large stage with advanced technological support. 1972 was the peak year for the festival movement in Australia. Closely following Sunbury was a Moomba concert at the Myer Music Bowl, which attracted a crowd of 250,000. I'll always remember surveying the wreckage at the end of that concert with the spring steel seatback supports lying flat on the row behind. Following Sunbury 1972, at Easter the same year was the Mulwala Rock Isle Festival. Sunbury was largely run by organisers from GTV9. Mulwala was largely run by organisers from HSV7. Located halfway between Melbourne and Sydney, it failed to attract sufficient attendance from either. It was rained out and shut down before the festival concluded. Following Mulwala, Sunbury reigned supreme in the Australian festival movement for the next 3 years. For the 1973 festival, little changed. Again, this small city in the valley of Jackson's Creek was recreated and operated successfully with a similar-sized audience to that in 1972. The festival resulted in Australia's first triple album, the first for Mushroom Records, and a record which provided the capital for that label's rapid expansion. 1974 saw an expansion of the stage lighting rig. As I wanted to concentrate on this, the effects screen were handed over to John McKissick's Clearlight. Again, the stage lighting rig was predominantly strand luminaires. If we had had a site safety officer, I'm sure he would not have okayed the improvised crawlway of planks threaded through the stage rafters and wired on with old coat hangers. But as they say, the past is a different country and they do things differently there. 1974 also saw the first Australian performance of British band Queen. They dawdled through their setup waiting for sunset so they could use my lighting. The sun and beer-soaked audience did not appreciate this. Incited by remarks from a stage compere, they reacted badly to a fine performance of unfamiliar songs. And Freddie Mercury's closing remarks about returning to Australia as the biggest band in the world were ultimately fulfilled. And by 1975, I was working in the audio department at GTV9, and I'd spent my leave for the past 3 years at Sunbury. With a recently acquired mortgage and a young family, I was not keen on spending a 4th year there. Both lighting and sound were handled by Sydney's Jans and saw the first appearance of Parkans at the festival. Unfortunately, it rained. Through an oversight in the location of the specified rain gauge outside the festival grounds, where it was not raining, no rain insurance was available. British band Deep Purple had been paid up front before boarding the plane to Australia, so there was no money to pay the Australian bands. Sadly dubbed Mudbury, it was a sad end to a fine festival. The Sunbury festivals gave birth to Mushroom Records, helped inspire a resurgence in Aussie music, and set the foundation for later festivals like Narara and Big Day Out. It also paved the way for the overseas success of bands like AC/DC, Little River Band, Men at Work, and In Excess. Although there were brief attempts to revive Sunbury, it was the child of its time. It could not be recreated. Audiences today require better facilities, and entertainment technology has improved exponentially. There will still be a requirement for large communal music gatherings, but they will not look like or feel like the festivals of the early 1970s. The Sunbury site is now an official reserve of historical significance. Housing intrudes on its perimeter. Although much of the site has been replanted by well-meaning locals, the concrete foundations of the toilet blocks and a portion of the fence around the stage compound remain. Importantly, the festival lives on in the memories of those who were there. Now, if I may be permitted a small plug, my book on the festivals is still available from melbournebooks.com.au. The book is primarily based on my memories of the festival, official records, newspaper archives, and a program of oral history I conducted. That oral history is now lodged with the Australian Music Vault Archive. I hope you've enjoyed this brief journey into the early archaeology of the early festival movement in Australia.